In the last section, we had some initial discussion about Browserify and how we're going to use it to fix the issue of loading our files in the incorrect order. To reiterate, we're going to make use of Browserify in 2 steps. We're going to first update our Gulpfile to use Browserify, and then we're going to refactor each of our components to make sure that they use the require syntax so that they require in the components that they need. So for example, thumbnail depends on badge to work correctly, so we're going to require in badge. As a reminder, Browserify makes use of that require keyword to figure out what order it needs to load the files in. Okay, so let's get started with our Gulpfile. First, we need to add some additional number of npm modules here. And unfortunately, there's going to be a hefty number, and it's going to be a little bit, kind of a long list. But once we start on the Gulpfile, we're going to walk through what each of them does. So bear with me for a second here while we install these. At my command line, and let's make sure that we're inside of our project directory, which for me is thumbnail-gulp. I'm going to write npm install --save. And now I'm going to include about 5 additional npm modules here. So let's make sure that we catch each of them. The first is going to be Browserify. And each of these is going to be separated by a space. So the first one's going to be Browserify, then Reactify, then vinyl-source-stream. Make sure you check the spelling on vinyl. The next one is Watchify, and then finally gulp-util. So we have all separated by spaces. We have Browserify, Reactify, vinyl-source-stream, Watchify, and gulp-util. All right, let's hit enter, and npm is going to do its thing. Oh, looks like I have a little typo there. My apologies. Not vinyl source steam, vinyl source stream. npm is going to do its thing and install each of these packages, which might take a second. Hopefully it goes pretty quickly. Well, while this is installing, oh, looks like we're done already. Fantastic. Now that we have all those additional packages installed, we're going to update our Gulpfile. To do so, we're going to be importing several more packages up here to start. So let's remove all the ones that are here right now, and we'll start from scratch. And let's just remove our default task in here as well, and we'll just go completely from scratch. So we're going to require about 6 modules here, and let's type them all out, and then we will walk through what each of them does. The first is going to be gulp. So I'll require gulp. The next is going to be gutil, or gulp-util for short. And that's going to be gulp-util. Next is source, and that's going to be our vinyl source stream. Let's remember the R this time. Next is Browserify, and that's just going to be Browserify. Watchify, and just one last one, Reactify. Okay, so we have 6 different ones in here: gulp, gulp-util, vinyl source stream, Browserify, Watchify, Reactify. It's a lot of ifis in here. Quick rundown on each module. Gulp, as we know, is the skeleton. It's responsible for the build process. gutil is essentially responsible for console logging output of our build process. So we're going to use gutil to print some information at the command line while the build process is running. So it's kind of there for debugging. Next is source, vinyl source stream. And this is used for handling, uh, basically for throwing our text files from one part of the build process to the other, to another. We have Browserify, which, as we discussed previously, is what's responsible for figuring out what part of our code depends on other parts of our code and making sure that load order is done correctly. Watchify is a nice little bonus in here that I think you're going to like a lot. It's a tool that's going to automatically rerun our gulp file for us whenever our code in here changes. So that means that whenever we make a change to our code, we don't have to come over to our command line and type out gulp again to start our build process of converting the JSX to JS again. Watchify is going to watch for changes inside of our source file, and whenever we change any file in here, it's going to rerun the build process. So it's a real fantastic little tool. And then finally, Reactify is going to be working in conjunction with Browserify to handle converting all of our JSX files into JS. All right, so a lot of tools in here. And for the rest of this section, we're going to be working through our gulp task in here, which again is going to be the process that gulp uses to actually execute our build. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to tell gulp that we have a task for it. This task, again, is going to be called default. And then we're going to pass it a function that tells it exactly what we want it to do. Next, we're going to create what's called a bundler. A bundler is responsible for running Browserify on our code base. So it's kind of the instantiate or the actual like object that we're going to be using to run Browserify on our code. There's a lot of configuration options in here, and let's get them all written out on the screen first, and then we'll walk through each one. So write var bundler equals Watchify, and then we're going to pass Watchify, Browserify. I know this terminology is getting crazy really fast, but bear with me. And then we're going to pass Browserify an object. And this object is going to have some configuration properties that we're going to pass to Browserify. So the first one is going to be entries. And entries is going to be basically the starting point of our application. It's going to be the first file that Browserify is going to look to determine how it's going to build or how it's going to include all these different files together. Remember, it's going to use the require statements found in each file to do that. So we're always going to pass in our basically our bootstrapping file, which for us is app, our file that starts off or kicks off the app, our entire application, because app is what's going to be basically the most parent component in here. And it's going to know about all the components that it needs to build itself. So we're going to give it a reference to app.jsx. And to do so, we're going to say, look in the current working directory, which is the // then look inside of the src directory, and then grab the app.jsx file. All right, the next one is transform Reactify. The transform tells Browserify that while it's figuring out our dependencies, it also needs to transform or compile our JSX to JS. And it's going to do this using the Reactify module. Next, we're going to specify the extensions. So these are the files that it needs to look at while it's doing the build process. And for us, it's just .jsx. And then finally, we've got a little bit of just a boilerplate, I would probably say. And that's going to be debug true. We're going to do cache as an empty object, package cache is an empty object, and finally full paths true. And these last couple ones right here are just boilerplate. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, good gosh, this is a lot of detail just for our build process. I don't blame you, but this is really kind of a one-time on a project per project basis. This is kind of a one-time deal. In general, we're not always going to be messing around with our build process. I just find it very important to know what is going on behind the scenes with our Gulp file. I've been using Gulp for a long time now, and I had a really bad habit where whenever I wanted to add some new feature to my build process, I would just go around and Google for other people's Gulp files until I found what I needed. And then I would copy paste it into my Gulp file and I would call it a day. And I found that having a better understanding of what all these entries did in my Gulp file really enabled me to do some more fancy build process things, like, for example, the Watchify, being able to watch my project for changes. That's something you could definitely Google around for and find out how to do by just copy pasting in some code. But really, it's very valuable to understand how your build process is working. So, in the context of this tutorial, uh, probably don't sweat so much about knowing exactly about all these different properties in here and what they're all doing, but do know that they exist and don't be afraid to figure out what they do and make changes yourself in the future. And most importantly, try to avoid just copy pasting around your Gulp file from project to project or off of Google directly. All right, so with my little rant out of the way, um, we now have our bundler formed up. And as a reminder, our bundler is basically the object that actually executes the build. And so we're going to wrap this up here in a handful of lines. And let's write them out first, and then we'll talk about what's actually happening. So I'm going to make a function called build with the input of file. I'm going to write if file exists, gutil.log, recompiling, then a space inside the string, plus file. Next, I'm going to return my bundler. And so I'm going to say return bundler.bundle. And I'm going to add an event handler on here. Again, we'll walk through what's happening here. For right now, let's get the code down on the page. So I'll say on error. Error is a string. gutil.log.bind. gutil browserify error. Next, I'm going to pipe source, and I'm going to pass source main a string main.js, and then I'm going to pipe gulp.dest, and then a reference to the current working directory, which is // handful or 3 more lines here. Bear with me. 2 more lines. I'm going to say build bundler on update build. Okay, so we got the code down. So now we can walk through it and do some investigation here. So our build function is what tells bundler to actually do something. Up here, we created the bundler and passed it some configuration options and said, here is this bundler object. It kind of just exists. It doesn't do anything yet. We rely upon this build function to actually go out and do something for us. So the build function is saying bundler, bundle. And bundle basically means go do your thing. Go do what we told you to do. The event handler here, on air, is a very handy little line. And what it does is it says, if there's ever an error during our bundling process, console log it out to our or go throw the output on our console, and then we as a developer can read that debug output and figure out what our error is. So you might ask yourself, well, what type of error could I possibly get into? And it's actually amazingly simple to get into some errors with Browserify sometimes. And the easiest way to do that is, for example, if I'm inside my application, so right now I am in app.jsx, and I say var thumbnail list equals require some random text in here. And so require is going to go off and look for a file called, well, this. And obviously I don't have that in my project, so that's going to throw an error. And that error is going to get logged out to my console thanks to this line right here. Let me delete this before we go any further. So this line, this error handle right here is really for catching any errors and making sure that it's going to help us debug the if we accidentally have any typos in our require statements. Next, the source line. These two lines right here, source and dest, are very similar to the previous concat dest in the previous version of the Gulp file that we had. And what it's going to do is it's going to say after your bundle is completed, after the bundler has ran, browserify has done its thing, all of our files have been converted to JavaScript and put in the right order, put it all into a single file called main.js. And we want that main.js file to be put into the current working directory, which is the /. The last two lines are first build, which tells the build function, we defined build, but we didn't run it. So we immediately run build. And then on update, and update is whenever we make a change to one of these files, just build again. So this is kind of a multi-stage process, but when you kind of break down what each chunk of code is doing, it's kind of clear what's going on here. Or I guess I would argue it's kind of clear. First off, just to reiterate what that process is we create the bundler, and the bundler is the object that we use to say, browserify, I want you to start at app.jsx. I want you to convert all my JSX to JavaScript. You should be looking at these files. And then I don't actually tell bundler to do anything until I write my build function. My build function says, hey, bundler, all right, you exist. I know you're out there and you're just hanging out, not doing anything yet, but I want you to run. I want you to go and compile all my files and join them all together and whatnot. When we run gulp at the command line, it's going to immediately build. So the first time we run gulp, it's going to go ahead and do its thing, compile our files for us. And then finally, anytime that we make a change to our files, which triggers the update event right here, it's going to build them again. Okay, so I hope that's a little bit more clear what's going on inside of our gulp file. Again, if it's not entirely clear what's going on, don't sweat it. So long as you have kind of the vague idea of what each of these chunks is doing, that's definitely enough, and we can pick up more over time. All right, so we've written our gulp file. Let's go ahead and see how it works. So let's write gulp. And fantastic. All right. It ran the default task and it finished it. So what that means is it ran this task and it executed build. And you can see that the terminal hasn't resolved yet. It's still hanging here. And that's because it's watching for updates via this on update, do another build command right here. So if I go into app.jsx and I make a change, so let's say I could put any arbitrary code in here. It's not actually going to execute this in this case. And I save it. And you'll see over here, it just recompiled app.jsx. Sweet. So this is fantastic. Our gulp file is actually working. Now there's just one last little step. Our gulp file is working, but our index.html file isn't actually going to work just yet because we haven't refactored our code to use the require syntax to make sure that, for example, app knows what thumbnail list is right now. So if I were to open up my index.html file right now, I would still get an error, unfortunately, because I don't have any idea what thumbnail list is. So we're going to resolve that in the next section. Hope to see you there.